option at the University of Waterloo and is currently a candidate for his Masters of Engineering at the University of Toronto in Mechanical Industrial Engineering. Gary's also a CPE through the BCPE. He's been working at Magna now for over 9 years and is the manager of the Global Ergonomics program. He's been implementing and developing the ergonomics program across all the plants, establishing the ergonomics guidelines, criteria, and auditing procedures, ensuring plant compliance to corporate standards and key metrics. And he provides ergonomic analysis, training, consultation, and so on to plant management and ergonomics teams. He's also been working on the development and integration of the Magna ergonomics database systems. And prior to his work at Magna, he's also worked at General Motors, Logitech, and General Electric. So I'm very pleased to introduce Gary Au. As I mentioned, we'll accumulate the questions and he'll stop at certain points. So please just, as we go, type them into the Q&A box. And when we get to those pauses, we'll try and answer the questions as best we can. I will put my microphone on mute while Gary's speaking. And Gary, if you want to come back on with your microphone, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Margot. I appreciate the introduction and being the first webinar, and definitely some technical issues, but hopefully everything is coming across clear. I wanted to just say that it's my pleasure on behalf of ACE to present this ACE webinar on implementing a global ergonomics program metric system across multiple plants. What I really want to cover today really is first to give you an idea of what Magna is as a company, sort of what kind of products do we manufacture, how the structure of our company is, and I think that's important because as I'll follow that up with how our systematic ergonomics program is in place, it does relate to the different industry that you're in, the different manufacturing, or in some cases different industry, not just manufacturing, but office, related factors. There's multiple industries that you could take some of these systematic things that we put in and perhaps take a look at possibly something to learn from and implement in your own sector or your own professions. So what I hope to do is provide a structure of how our system works. This is actually a continuation of a presentation I made at the ACE conference this past year, and that was just maybe a 10 to 15 minute preview, but what I hope to do more in detail today is really provide some of those ergonomics criteria elements that I didn't get a chance to present at that conference, and hopefully these will give you some aspects into the details of our program. I also want to talk about some of the results, as it's been about 5 years since we've implemented this systematic approach, and hopefully I could present to you some of the initial findings that we've found in regards to statistics. I want to also cover some of the continuous improvement ideas and implementations that we put in place and sort of the future of where we're going with this program. And lastly, just a summary, a few slides, and just some of the issues and challenges we're facing with the global rollout. So to start, I wanted to give you an overview of Magna International. We are a global company that's situated not just in Canada, but throughout the world. You see in this graph here, you have the red numbers on top for each country. It represents the amount of manufacturing plants. The blue number below are the number of engineering, product design, development, sales offices. So you can see we have 46 in Canada, but sometimes people don't know that we're actually have quite a bit of manufacturing in Western Eastern Europe, and we're starting to grow specifically in the regions of Asia and South America. These are probably the two fastest growing areas in our company. Our company is totaling about over 108,000 employees across 26 countries, and last year's revenue or sales was at $28.7 billion. We are a tier 1 supplier in the automotive sector. which that means that we supply parts to all the original equipment manufacturers, the OEMs. So for example, Ford, GM, Chrysler, BMW, Volkswagen, those are some of our bigger customers, and we pretty much supply them with every part of the vehicle except for tires, but pretty much cover all other areas. What's different about Magna is its unique culture, and I think every company, no matter where you go or where you work for, has a unique culture. For Magna, some of the key things that we have as our culture are the corporate constitution and the employee charter. So within our employee charter is one principle that relates to a safe and healthful workplace, and ergonomics falls under that charter. We have very many avenues within our plants that ensure that these principles are held. We have employee advocates at each plant that ensures that their full-time position is making sure these charter principles are being are working and actually happening in real life in the plants. And we also have an anonymous hotline in case some of these avenues are not working. So we have a very employee empowerment type of culture, which definitely has one that empowers them for new ideas and to just be transparent. We also are unique in the sense that we're a very decentralized management type of organization where we are separated into a number of Magna groups, and each of them have a reporting president and have a structure of their own. This next two slides give you kind of an overview of the different products and different groups within Magna. And I think in an easy way to explain it is that Magna is probably separated into separate product groups. And these groups include seating systems, interior systems, exterior systems, which involves bumpers, like fascias, and other items, closure systems. As you can see in this outline, you can see that at the bottom you have the number of employees and the approximate number of manufacturing sites we have across these product groups. We also have body and chassis systems, roof systems, powertrain systems, electronics, and even a joint venture in hybrid and electrical vehicle systems. So this gives you kind of an overview of the major groups within Magna and the different parts they make within these groups. As far as a reporting structure, at the corporate level, the Magna corporate ergonomists all report to the Health and Safety Director, which both are under the umbrella of Human Resources. The Human Resources has a vice president who sits on the executive team to make sure all the objectives of HR are throughout the whole company. Magna corporate is who sets the global standards across all of the plants. At the plant level, the highest position would be the plant manager, and they report to the presidents of each of those Magna groups I mentioned. Each plant is responsible to meet the outlined global standards. Some interesting things I thought I'd put in as well is that majority of the plants majority of the plants at Magna are non-unionized, and a majority of the plants do not have a full-time ergonomist. What I wanted to give everyone is sort of a historic look or just a snapshot of our ergonomics program in 2003 to 2005, and that was not too long after I started. And perhaps this is important because you can see sort of as this presentation goes along the different things we've done to sort of try to improve our ergonomics program and try to really drive forward some change. And including that is today's presentation about a systematic process. In 2003, when we started, we had an ergonomics section in the health and safety audit. So the health and safety audit was conducted every 3 years or every year, depending on performance. Each of the plants were sort of required to have an ergonomics committee, and that involved getting trained in the established ergonomic analysis tools. So they were beginning to have quantitative tools and be able to get risk scores from it. A design guideline was developed where they could use in their launch stages, as well as some of the redesigns within their plants. And lastly, the Magna corporate ergonomists also helped facilitate action plan management. Throughout these years, we recognized that there were some needs in the program and some ways that we could move forward in our ergonomics teams and program. Some of the things that were identified were that we needed to provide a more clear ergonomic structure and system throughout all the plants. That we had to get a program management tool into the hands of the ergonomics committees and team members at the plants locally. Another need that we identified was to increase more two-way interaction and feedback from the corporate ergonomists. Lastly, it was important that we started to increase the frequency of ergonomic metrics and reporting. So this is now a look at what are some of the steps that we took now that you've seen where we've come from in implementing a systematic ergonomics program. Some of the steps that we took, as you can see, there's a double arrow for management support and pilot project success. I think sometimes the management support is there first and therefore leads to a pilot project, or sometimes for many cases a pilot project success is what leads to management support. Either way, these two key aspects are very important for any implementation. So once we had both of those, we were able to set a set of very specific criteria for each plant. We then were able to create an online metric system. Through that, we were able to facilitate and build templates and support to the plants to help drive them meet these criteria elements. And then just continuous improvement. We didn't necessarily get everything right the first time around, but as we build things, we continue to improve things, getting feedback from the plants, the team members, the coordinators, the management teams, in understanding what it is that these ergonomic teams at each plant need to successfully have an effective ergonomics program. So with the pilot project, which took place in 2006, was first identified through one Magna group, let's call it XYZ. They had suffered significant losses in workers' comp claims in 04 and 05, and these costs for ergonomic claims were literally in the millions of dollars. So that, in some ways, had already gained us some management support. And as unfortunate as that is, and I think many people may be listening today have injuries and illness claims that are surmounting to a large amount of money, even though our job is to prevent these injuries and to reduce these costs, if that is the state of where you're at, it also acts as an opportunity to gain some support, because definitely when you're talking about millions of dollars or any cost that's going out the door, you've already immediately got management's attention, and potential solutions and pilot projects can be more likely in those cases. So we started with a pilot project of 11 Magna plants within this group. We developed 5 basic categories and measured them every quarter, so that's every 3 months. And we rated them on a simple green, yellow, and red system. And you can see in the bottom right corner, it was simply what you do in a pilot project. It was literally a Word document that was sent to those 11 plants, explaining what they were being measured on, and we were evaluating them every quarter through the submission of documentation that they were providing us. So as we continue down this road, you can see that we have all the plants listed and all the 5 categories being measured. Even in a 6-month period of time, we saw that a lot of yellow and red areas, or blocks in this case, were quickly turned into a lot of green blocks in even a short amount of time. So after a year of this pilot project, we were able to demonstrate sort of before and after in the sense of the effectiveness of this metric system. So with this specific Magna group, 3 of the 11 plants were in the US. And as far as workers' comp claims, as you guys all know, in the WSIB, it's a little bit more challenging to get the dollars related to specific ergonomic related type of injuries. And so, but in our case with the US, it's much easier because we have a private insurance carrier that allows us to get very specific and up-to-date statistics. So for the US plants, we can see in these 3, plant A, B, and C, that 2 out of the 3 showed a significant reduction in the frequency of ergo claims pre and post. More importantly, this pilot project was also able to show a significant reduction in cost from before and after. And so you can see that all 3 of the US plants that were measured showed a significant reduction. And even in plant C, for example, was spending over $1 million in comp claims and had that reduced into half. Through this, for the next 2 years, we also monitored it and we calculated the amount of savings and ultimately a rebate check that was written back to these 3 plants. You can see that 2.5 million US dollars was literally given back to these plants based on performance and the reduction of ergonomic claims. After this pilot project, it demonstrated that workers' compensation was seen as a primary way to cut costs and save money in general. Magna wanted to see these changes globally. Not only did we want to look at reducing the risk and reducing the injuries to the workers, we wanted to support and reduce some of the cost, and this was supported by the group presidents and the board of directors, which ultimately helped drive this program into all the plants. It took some time, of course, going from a pilot project over to an embedded system. It took some time to develop this, and we spent a fair amount of time as a team deciding on some of the important aspects, criteria, how it was going to be designed. Some of the goals that were really important that we try to stress in the sense of developing the system were that we wanted to ensure that this system that was going to be rolled out had the resources and the proper tools to manage ergonomic injuries and their cost. We wanted a system that looked at identifying new ergonomic risk factors during the launch phase that would eliminate them ultimately at the beginning before they hit the shop floor. We wanted the plants to develop an internal responsibility system where issues day in and day out can be dealt with all within the plant itself. And lastly, at the time, we wanted to reduce ergonomic injuries, which were at least 50% of Magna's worker compensation cost. So part of this brainstorming and development, what were some of the things that we need to establish to get to a global metric? Well, first thing we wanted to do was start with just maybe one continent, or in this case, Canada, US, and Mexico. Those 3 countries alone were approximately 120 plants, and we thought that would be a good start to this system. We also looked at setting the specific criteria elements that we wanted to keep each of the plants accountable for. And we took a fair amount of time to decide upon these elements. We looked at numerous case studies, we looked at scientific research studies, we looked at journals, we looked at different textbooks and different guidelines in order to come up with a set of criteria that have been demonstrated in the past that have shown success in the effectiveness of an ergonomics program. So these were some of the criteria, rationale and resources we used to come up with the criteria elements. One thing we also required was to build and develop a robust scoring method to basically calculate the criteria elements and ultimately lead to a scoring in not only in categories but in an overall score for ergonomics for each plant. What was also quickly noticed that we needed to do this, especially amongst a number of numerous plants, was that we needed a fully customizable ergonomics database and website. This would allow us to provide what the corporate requirements are clearly, so that's the criteria elements. It would allow us to provide immediately the tools and templates to assist the plants. It would allow us to communicate changes, news, or updates. And importantly, as I mentioned, allows that improvement on the two-way communication. So we needed to make sure that it had a significant feedback mechanism built into it. So what I want to do in this next section is talk about the metric system structure that was put in place. Now that I've given you a little history of how we came to implement this program. The structure of this system is one that you might have seen before. It's very similar to PDCA or Plan, Do, Checked, Act, or any continuous improvement type of model that looked at really just establishing our support infrastructure first, and then going through the stages of analyze, prioritize, implement, follow up, communicate, and measure, and continually to move in this pathway. As I said, we took the pilot project, and there was quite a bit of fine-tuning, a lot of things we learned in that 1 year, and a lot more research that we did in order to come up with these 5 major categories. That within these 5 categories were 26 criteria specific elements. The type of system that was going to be was really a self-evaluation system by the plant, where the plants, to gain credit, would need to measure themselves but also submit the appropriate documentation that meets the criteria. And lastly, like any good process, you need to have auditing or accountability. So the Magna corporate ergonomists would review these documents and their self-evaluation each quarter. So here you see in the blue boxes are the 5 different categories each of the plants are being measured on. And they follow nicely in sort of a flow chart. And so the first one is support infrastructure. And really, in support infrastructure is where the plant develops their policy and procedure. They get the necessary training and knowledge they need to perform their roles in ergonomics, whether it's the ergonomics team or the management team or the operators and supervisors. Once that's been developed, the analysis and prioritization can happen of the different jobs throughout the plant. So the ergonomics team can start to use those tools they learned in the training to analyze risk. On the same token, for the engineering design category, this category looks at launch or new workstations. And again, at this point, you could look at using a design checklist or some analysis tools in order to identify problems. Whether it's on the shop floor or in a new launch, both of them will lead to risk factors and risk. And this leads to our 4th category, which is implementation and risk reduction. And so in this category, the plants were being measured on their ability to close and complete action items, reduce risk on jobs, and ultimately fix problems that were identified through their analysis. Category 5 is metrics and communication. And like any good program, you must measure it to see where the weaknesses are, where the strengths are in order to improve. These 5 categories would receive a dot score, what we call it, and each category would get either a green, green-yellow, yellow, red-yellow, or full red dot. And these different spectrum of colors identify what the performance is for each of those different categories. And the overall rating would be based on all 5 of these categories combined together. So here is a quick snapshot of the roadmap, in some ways, what the plants received. This is a snapshot of their website or interactive database that they use. So you can see that it's clearly laid out as far as the different categories here in the dark gray. Under each of the categories, you can see are the individual criteria elements that are very specific. Next to that is the value of each of the criteria elements. It could be anywhere from very high, medium, or low. And each of these values represents the weighting of those criteria elements in the program. So it's no coincidence that some of the more higher value items are items that are more important to implement and that are being measured on more highly in this overall rating system. The status column would just simply be whether they checked it off, whether it's complete or not. So you can see that each of these criteria items work off of the all or nothing approach. So you would either get the full value for that criterion or you would not. And you can see the final column is the icon of the attachments that they would be submitting each quarter to provide the proof that they've completed these criteria items. The flags, as you can see, are the ones that are raised by corporate in their review, and these flags indicate and communicate to the plants which of those criteria items, in most cases, had some kind of feedback from the corporate team. So to go in a little bit more detail, this training session, we don't have enough time to go into every single criteria element, as you can see, but I wanted to show you what's beyond just this page you see. If, for example, if I went to click on to 1.1, which is the policy and procedure, it would bring me to this page. It would allow me to see exactly what the details of what's required for this specific criteria item. It provides what documents are required in order to meet this. It will allow you to browse and find it where it's on your network drive or your computer to submit this document. And lastly, they would check this off as far as completion of this item. Each of our criteria elements, we provided a template. One of the important things we felt was to have at the beginning were templates to really get them going in the right direction. We didn't want the teams to spend too much time reinventing the wheel or developing templates or Excel sheets to help them. So what we try to do, and you'll see in the further in this presentation, we try to just have them focus on entering the information from the plant, whether it's a risk assessment or an action plan. So here is just a sample of a policy and procedure template that they would use in order to develop and modify. As you know, Magna we have some plants that are 50 operators. We have some plants that have over 2,000, and you can imagine a policy and procedure should reflect that, and the resources, the methodology would be quite different, and their policy should reflect that and the procedure of how their ergonomics program works. As I mentioned before, here is a snapshot of the corporate review. In this case, this was something to do with one of their implementations, criteria elements. And here is an area where, as I said, we were trying to improve the two-way communication. You can see that the comments here in the yellow box are when they submit their document, if they wanted to add some information or add some comment for us as auditors to look at it and as we're reviewing the documents. And in this case, unfortunately, they did not receive credit for this specific criterion. And so in our reviews at the corporate level, we would remove the checkbox, and then provide a flag explanation as to exactly what the reason was, and also hopefully some feedback to help them gain this credit next quarter. So this is the system and format that would happen each and every quarter, and this is just one example, one criteria. at the end of the day, when all the elements are looked at and reviewed, the final scores would come out. So you would get a final score in each category, as I mentioned, and this would be the scorecard that would be produced. And so this is a scorecard that is often used by the plant manager or different managers within the plant to really get an overview of what's going on in the ergonomics program. Specifically, maybe what areas within the program that need support. And just to give you an overview also to management teams and the coordinators of the ergonomics teams, and also an idea of their progress or lack of that, if that was the case. So the next section, and what I want to do before I move on to the specific ergonomics program criteria, I do want to stop, as I've covered a number of areas about the structure of our company and the initial steps we took to implement this metric system. And now that you understand a little bit about how it works, I wanted to stop and see if there was any questions.
So Gary, there have been some questions that have come in here.
Okay.
So the first one is, did you develop an in-house metric system, or was there an external product that was suitable?
Good question, and it was a fully customized in-house product. And so we did, in our process, we did, you know, like all companies, when you ask for some budget or some money, they want to see 3 quotes. And so we did look at a number of external vendors who had out-of-the-box sort of ergonomics program management systems, but they quickly got eliminated either because of cost or because the lack of customization that could really be developed to what we wanted, as you see. So the answer to that was that we have hired an external programmer to a programming company to really build this database website from scratch.
Thank you. Just going back to some of the introductory information, when you did that pilot project and there was the $2.5 million check, was it WCB or Magna Corporate that was writing that back to the plant sites?
That was our insurance carrier, so it wasn't Magna to Magna, but it was because of the way our insurance carrier, if your performance, because they have an sort of, kind of like in WSB, you know, an expected cost every year, but because we were well under what that was, that there was a rebate check literally given back. So that is money in the bank in your pocket that was not there before for those plants.
Thanks, Gary. Another question, could you be specific about some of the implementations you made in the pilot project that showed such dramatic results?
Whew, that's difficult. I mean, of course, reduction of costs, we saw a lot of, and if I had some slide more time, and I could show some of the before and afters of some of the solutions that were put in place for this specific group. But you'll see later on in the presentation, you do see some snapshots of some of the different, not just from this specific group, but of others that that led to that reduction. And it's not, since then, it's not just a pilot project, but now we're seeing that throughout different groups in Magna. But they would be, at this point, many to list off. But and some of it, to be honest, we don't see necessarily every single solution. We track their statistics. We tracked the ones that they've closed out, and I'll be mentioning this a little bit later. You know, it's difficult with a small corporate team. In this case, looking at this point from 2007, 120 plants, we're not in all of the plants on a regular basis.
Thanks, Gary. I sense maybe another webinar sometime. A question on, could you please clarify exactly what you meant by ergonomic injuries? So what's kind of the scope of injuries, I guess, that would have been included in those?
Sure, and that's a good question. I get asked that from many of our plants as they learn how to develop that, and you know, of course, we communicate that to try to make sure that it's standardized and that we're comparing one plant to another fairly. And when we define an ergonomic injury or incident, and that's why it's so much easier in the in the U.S. comp, because we get a lot of that description, body part, and type. But any kind of incident that's related to an ergonomic risk is what's considered ergonomics related injury. So we'll look at the different categories. I can't go through all the categories that are split off in our comp provider, but they, by repetitive motion, exertion by pushing, exertion by pulling, sore wrists, these types of injuries that are very clear. And I spent a lot of time with our U.S. workers' compensation manager in order to come up with a systematic way to do this fairly, because for example, the common example is you might get a strain, a back strain, and some people might automatically put that into the ergonomic related injury, but you really need to look further than that. You need to look at what was the root cause of that back strain. So if someone tripped and strained their back, well, that's not an ergonomic related incident. So we were making sure to weed out those ones, and the ones that were related to repetitive motion, or even sometimes in acute situations related to heavy lifting or loading, those would be considered ergonomic as well. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more clarification.
Thanks, Gary. How were the low, medium, high ratings assigned?
Low, medium, high is that in regards to the metrics themselves, you think, or do you think it probably relates to the different criteria, because I haven't talked about the tools yet. But in relation to the low, medium, high, in regards to each criteria and the weighting, as I said, we felt as a team, based on the research we did in literature and the case studies, our own experience to a certain part, and talking to other ergonomist professionals from other companies, but more so all the combination of that, that's how we came up with some of the critical elements that was overlapping in all those avenues I just mentioned. Those ones would typically have the high value, as in has been demonstrated to be important elements to effectiveness. That's how we determine them.
Okay. And I guess somewhat related, when the modifications were made by each plant to the policies and procedures, did corporate have an idea of what modifications would be appropriate to constitute a pass?
That part was a little bit challenging, and so that's a very good question. And as much as we like to be involved with the plant, it was very difficult to do that. So we would review the procedure. I mean, Magna plants, a lot of them are similar but different at the same time. So we had, after reviewing enough procedures and knowing what each of the groups do and how they do things, that was what we sort of evaluate on it. But to the specific details, we weren't so caught up on trying to nail them for those details, because we really feel that for an effective procedure is that really those people in the plant that know how things are done and the reporting structures, and those are the people that should be ultimately making those decisions. I mean, we had some major areas that they had to cover in a proper procedure, but as far as the details of how that's done, we really do feel that the people at the plant, if done properly, would be better at developing that procedure, and we would stay a little bit away from that.
How did the rollout of the program affect staffing or man hours?
It was tough. I don't think that I would love to say that once we rolled out the program, each of the plants hired an ergonomist, but I think for the most part that wasn't the case, and it meant a lot of burden on numerous people in the plant, specifically, obviously, the HR, health and safety coordinator, and you'll see the engineering manager. But there's no doubt that this put a significant amount of more work that they weren't doing in the past. I mean, it's not that they weren't doing ergonomics, but there was a lot more formal reporting and documentation, which we feel was needed. So somehow, and many things that happen at Magna, it takes some time, but the resources or the time for those people were created, and the proper resources were put in, especially in those effective programs. I mean, those kind of things don't happen overnight, but we see that more and more, and it's becoming more clear that they're attributing the right resources to what's needed to get this done. Because if they don't, then they see their dot scores suffer, and they know sometimes it's a lack of resource. Sometimes it's not, but when it is, they'll start to put more people hours or people sometimes towards that.
And was this program integrated into the overarching health and safety program, or is it a standalone program?
No, in a way, it's definitely within safety, as those dots are reported to on a quarterly basis by the director of safety, and part of those metrics, you have all your safety metrics, but a standalone ergonomics dot is next to the safety metrics, and as well. So I would say that it falls under the safety umbrella, which ultimately falls under the HR umbrella.
And do you think a multi-unionized facility would impact your process?
Yes and no. I think I'm trying to think about the plants that are unionized, because we do have a few that are unionized. For those plants I know, it has not affected that at all. I think some of those plants have been very successful even, and I think for the most parts the union reps, they saw it as a good thing, because it just added more pressure or more resources towards helping their operators on the shop floor and making sure that they weren't exposed to risks in ergonomics.
And this will be the last question of this section. Do you see any significant differences in performance between facilities that have a plant ergonomist and those that do not?
I think I don't have any statistics to back that up. I know that the way they run the ergonomics program, and I think there's a couple ergonomists even from Magna on, and so they can type in their feedback as well. But I think it'd be hard to say there's a difference, but I would, not in the sense that I don't know, but I definitely think those plants that have an ergonomist, it's a completely different challenge. Typically, those few plants that we have a full-time ergonomist, those are huge plants. I mean, you're talking in the thousands of people, and that's probably why, and in many cases, why I justified full-time ergonomists in those situations. So, and those plants with ergonomists are very successful for the most part, to say that. But a difference, it's hard for me to say or to even comment on that. But they have very, very good programs.
Let's continue on, and any other questions coming in, we'll get to the next point there. See, that's we're moving on in time here.
Sure, no problem. Okay, the next section is really talking about the specific criteria, and I'm going to try to speed up a bit because I think those questions are great, and those are the questions I'm probably familiar to even being asked within our own company. So you guys are asking the right things. I'm going to spend some time and talk about the specific elements, and what I want to try to do is quickly go over each criteria elements. I'm not going to spend time on each one because I don't think we have enough time to do that, but I do want to just touch upon some of the strengths and some of the challenges within each of the categories. I hope that will help. So if we start off with category 1, the support infrastructure, you can see that 1.1 is the written policy and procedure implemented. 1.2 is having a cross-functional ergonomics team that's fully trained and meets on a bi-weekly basis. We have 1.3 is that the engineering manager leads and directs the activities of the ergonomics committee. 1.4 is that the management team personnel have been fully trained and understand the impact of ergonomics and also the metrics and how each plan is being measured in regards to this in regards to ergonomics. 1.5 is that supervisors and operators have been trained to identify basic ergonomic risks. And 1.6 is setting a suitable budget that can be used when money is needed for solutions. So the two areas first I want to talk about within this is the ergonomics committee. Just to give you a little bit more detail, we have typically, if it's a newly formed team, they were required to meet bi-weekly. And after scoring an overall score of yellow, they were able to have the choice to either meet bi-weekly continually or meeting once a month. Each of the meetings had to be required to be separate and independent of the Joint Health and Safety Committee. Each meeting had to have meeting minutes, and those were submitted in the documentation in the system. Each team had a sort of a minimum requirement, so therefore it was definitely cross-functional. And lastly, the engineering manager had to be the lead and direct the committee. That didn't mean that they did all the work, but they had to champion this ergonomics team and also delegate responsibility as needed. Ergonomics training is a big part of Category 1. Of course, to get the support structure in there, we needed to make sure the management team was trained, the ergonomics committee, supervisors, and even the engineering and maintenance tooling people. So here you see the different roles, the duration of the training, and sort of who this instructor typically was to provide this training. So some of the strengths of the support infrastructure are that management web training was very effective by providing a consistent platform and information to all management team members. And you can imagine that it doesn't make sense, or it doesn't make cost-effective sense to travel for at least people at the corporate team to go to these plants for a 1-hour training session. And so we did that through web training. We would offer two out of every 3 months we would have a session that they could join in, so that also added flexibility in case certain months that management team couldn't member. But it's important for them to be on the same page and understand what they're being evaluated on. Engaged engineering manager, this was definitely a strength. That this, by far, when we looked at the different plants within Magna that had the engineering manager really take ownership of the ergonomics committee and team versus the ones that didn't, we saw a pretty significant change or a pretty significant difference between those plants with a fully engaged engineering manager. It led to many implemented solutions. In general, it led to a multidisciplinary approach on everything. So it wasn't just within the ergonomics committee. Whenever they were designing new products, designing new equipment, they would all involve ergonomics, because I think once they're engaged, it involves many aspects of their job. Another thing that we found that was particularly strong, or that was useful for the criteria, that having the structured independent committee meetings outside the Joint Health and Safety Committee was important, because that allowed suitable time allocation to discuss issues and progress in their action plan or program. Some of the challenges, and we talked about this in one of the questions, is that we did have a fair number of plants that didn't really take the time to tailor their policy and procedure. They would, cut and paste certain things, and really defeating the purpose of a customized one. So, we made some changes to this to ensure that, but that was definitely a challenge, an issue. Setting a budget didn't necessarily mean the money was available when needed. So we did start to see plants that had a budget set aside, and they showed us through their accounting documentation. But what we found in many cases, at least at Magna, is that by the year end, even though the budget hasn't been used, or that the budget for that hasn't been used, if the money was used up as in total from operations, that they wouldn't sometimes get that money. So that became a challenge as well. And I think it shouldn't be a surprise that there was a lot of initial resistance from the engineering managers to lead the ergonomics committee, because we fully know that they are very busy individuals with a lot of responsibility. And so we did have to fight through that. In many cases, numerous cases, I remember many engineering managers being adamant about not doing this, and sort of in the end trying to put it together. But 6 months, 9 months later, we would hear a totally different story after they've been using the program and systematically incorporating them. So I think what we learned from this is that the initial resistance sometimes is expected, but after time, we saw them to soften up, but more importantly, see the value in the program and the tools and the templates and impacting what they do in their regular job, as well as reducing risk to their operators. Category 2 is the analysis and prioritization. Again, this is mainly focused on evaluating the plants, how well they're doing at job assessments, basically. So if we look at 2.1, it's progress made on ergonomic evaluations for all plant jobs. 2.2 is looking at a design checklist filled out for all those jobs, all those job evaluations. So 2.1 looked at your typical analysis tools that looked at viewing the human body, and the different risks. 2.2 looked at the actual dimensions of the workstation equipment, so to make sure to cover those two areas. 2.3 is basically based on the results and review of injury data that they've prioritized their jobs as far as risk. 2.4 was ergonomic incidences or operator reports of discomfort and concern have been documented and followed up within 30 days. And 2.5, lastly, is body part scores from the analysis tool have been used to define and develop an effective job rotation. So there's a couple things I want to talk about. First, some of you might be asking, ergonomic analysis, what do you mean by the progress? So each of the plants were required to do a minimum of 3 job evaluations per month, or 9 per quarter. And the tools, this is just a sample of some of the tools that a plant might use. These were the analysis tools, but you can see that what we try to do definitively is that the scores that came out of those tools, we wanted to make sure that they were in one of 4 color risk ratings: very high, high, moderate, or low. As the plants were progressing in doing their analysis at the plant, they would enter all the information into this spreadsheet we call the Ergonomics Risk Management Spreadsheet, which covers off 3 of the criteria areas. I do want to stop and pull up a live copy of this sheet because I'm assuming you can see this because I'm sharing my screen. But this is an example of the Ergonomic Risk Management Spreadsheet, and you can see the first page is ultimately where you put the job name and you see which tools were being used. On the bottom here, you can see each of the tabs represents a spreadsheet where they can put the information for each of the tools. So if I go to the ERA tracking sheet, the ERA stands for Ergonomic Risk Assessment, which is an internal magnet tool. You can see that each score that you enter automatically gets color-coded through the macro as far as high, medium, low for that body part, but it also gives you that category, the overall score for that particular job in this overall column here. So this first section is the baseline score, so that's the initial assessment. Over on the right-hand side, you see what we call the follow-up scores, and so this is after you put in the control or implementation solution. This is the scores you reevaluate using the same tool, and these are sort of the after scores, and therefore you can see the sort of the risk reduction through the implementation. Now this is just one tool. You can see, as I said, we have this spreadsheet for each of the different tools in a program. These overall scores from each of the tools are then automatically pushed into this one page called a priority matrix. And so this is possibly an area sheet where the team can come to, or the ergonomics coordinator, and take a look, more of a bird's eye view of the different tools that were used for specific jobs, but more importantly, the different risk scores and risk of these that were shown in those tools, and really gives them a basis to do better at prioritizing and seeing all the jobs at once. So that's the ergonomic risk management spreadsheet. Some of the strengths in this section that we found was that for the job analyses, that we learned quickly that focusing on the progress rather than having all the requirement be all the jobs are evaluated immediately did benefit. I mean, definitely there was some coaching involved on which areas of the plants, what are some indicators, injuries or absenteeism or complaints, these things to direct the plants to where to start these job analyses. So we wanted to make sure that they were doing a significant amount of analyses, but we didn't want to freeze them up from working on some of the solutions, because some of our plants could have literally hundreds of jobs and it could take a year or two before they complete all the assessments. So we wanted them to give a manageable amount and for them to start to work on some of the solutions. The ERM spreadsheet is tied to, as I said, allowed everything to be tied to one area. The macros reduced redundancy and it was color coded. It made prioritization much easier, and really it made a place for them to store the ergonomic evaluations. A lot of the team members spent a significant time doing these assessments, and it was nice for them to see that all compilated into one area as opposed to in a stack of papers or even in a folder on a network drive. So these were some of the strengths. Some of the challenges were corrupted macros. Anytime you work with Excel, I'm sure you know, these were somewhat complicated macros, and we did see some corruption especially when they started altering it themselves. And we also saw some challenges with what we call one-man shows, where there was only one person or two maybe doing all the ergonomic evaluations every quarter. And what we found was difficult was that a lot of the remaining team members would forget how to use the tools after the training, or that they would start to less understand some of the results when those tools spit out numbers and results. So we still try to encourage them that they should have a shared workload, so they're constantly using these tools as a form of a way to continue the consistency of not forgetting how to use them. So this leads to category 3, which is the implementation. So basically, how is the plant doing as far as making changes on the plant floor? So 3.1 looks at one solution per quarter. They had to show that they did a cost-benefit analysis. 3.2 is basically having a fully developed action plan, so just having it. 3.3 is jobs that fall within the top 5 have caused an ergonomic incident. Jobs that fall within the top 5 or have caused an incident are improved within 90 days. And so that's the one where it really looks at you have to actually show that you've made a change. 3.4 is for those changes, and then the follow-up analysis would have to happen within 30 days. So 3.1 and 3.5 kind of look at pre and post solution. And so all we were asking really is one solution, not all of them, but they had to submit a cost-benefit analysis they did either through injury claim history, payback period. There's a number of different methods you can do this. The other thing was, amongst all the solutions they put in place, they also had to pick one and show sort of a reduction in cycle time maybe, or a reduction in defects in quality due to specifically one of their ergonomic solutions. So some of the strengths of this particular category was that having the risk reduction requirement for solutions implemented really ensured that these changes were impactful as far as risk, but also ensured that plants were doing a follow-up analysis. Another positive was the cost-benefit analysis, either before or even showing productivity or quality improvement. It really started to change the mindset and culture of ergonomics at the plant. So instead of, you know, plants management or engineers thinking that ergonomics is always, you know, injuries and prevention of injuries, work comp costs, that it started to sort of change the mindset that, you know, ergonomics can really be a win-win, where we can reduce these injuries, but it's also going to help our bottom line in the sense of efficiency and better quality products. Some of the challenges from implementation risk reduction category 3 was that we had this top 5 sort of approach, but then we quickly found out that a lot of plants had, you know, more moderate risk fixes, but they were easy to fix. You know, you guys know that as quick fixes. So it was the right balance between, you know, making sure that they were closing out items, but still looking at the highest risk jobs in their plant. So we actually struck a balance, and, you know, sometimes even when we suggested that maybe it's beneficial for your plant to have a top 5 highest risk jobs and a top 5 quick fixes, but any sort of combination of that we were accepting. A lot of the challenges were having a ergonomics Excel spreadsheet as the action plan. We saw many action plans that are very disorganized and difficult to read at some points. And the last challenge was definitely, I think, a lot of us here in the industry and as ergonomists definitely share, is that executing the action itself to completion. Often, a lot of times, the difficult part is getting money to implement the solution, but in combination sometimes, it's kind of overlapping, is also the support from management operation. They kind of go hand in hand. Category 4 is engineering design, and really this looks at being proactive. Are the plants being proactive at the plant with new launches and new products coming in? So 4.1 looks mainly at is an ergonomic design checklist officially embedded into the design process, the engineering design process. 4.2 is project information related to launches are sent forward and provided. 4.3 is actually completed design checklists on ergonomic new workstations that are coming into your plant. JAX software has been used to assess complex launches, and action plan has been developed for this. 4.5 is at least 2 engineers and maintenance tooling staff have been trained in ergonomics. And so these 2 engineers and maintenance people would have to be outside the ergonomics committee. So this generally was to try to improve the awareness of ergonomics, not of different departments that we felt were very important in the design aspect. The 2 category, I just want to point out that criteria 4.3 and 4.4 were probably the only criteria elements that could be marked not applicable by the plants each quarter, simply because if you didn't have a new launch or new workstations coming in, obviously our expectation is not that you filled out any design checklists, so they could mark 4.3 not applicable. Same with 4.4. Not every project required JAX software, even if there was a launch, so they were able to mark that not applicable as well. So some of the strengths to the engineering design was that it allowed plants to have a design checklist embedded. A lot of them didn't have that before this, so now they have a design checklist embedded in their engineering process. And the good thing about the checklists were that they were required to be signed off by both the engineer and a member of the ergonomics committee. Some of the challenges we felt that we found were that there was no accountability as far as when and how many times the design checklist was being used or completed. So we know many times in a launch stage there's conception, there's prototyping, there's final, there's many different stages and major significant changes. And so there was no way for us to know how many times or at what stage. Ultimately, we would want them to be using it throughout, especially during times of major drastic changes. The Siemens JAX simulation program was only licensed to our corporate team. Therefore, it was, and of course the skill of training behind that as well was a factor too, because only the corporate team was really trained. We do have a few plants that have ergonomists that were using it, but for most parts, it was limited based on the time that the ergonomists had at corporate. And in general, a big challenge for us moving forward is that there is no consistent design engineering process because we're separated into different groups, that each of the groups have a pretty unique manufacturing process and design, and we still need to sort of put more time and effort into carving these out within each of the groups. I know Arita Locke, who is one of our ergonomists for our body and chassis group, she's on board, and in our body and chassis group, she's the ergonomist for that group and for their standards team, and they've done a great job in coming out with a very definitive, specific process and looking at ergonomics at the initial stages, and that could be the basis of a webinar too. So category 5, the last one, is really metrics and communication. First, 5.1 is short-term measures have been collected and documented. So that's short-term measures. What we mean that is percentage of workstations evaluated, percentage of jobs reduced by 1 risk level, percentage of people trained, those kind of things. Annual ergonomic incidence and severity targets. We want the plants to set specific targets as far as ergonomic incidences. Long-term measures have been collected, documented, and forwarded. This is your traditional injury statistics with incidences, lost time days. We wanted 5.4 lost time and short-term metrics to be communicated to the rest of the plant. And lastly, 5.5 is employee feedback in regards to ergonomic conditions. And this is basically putting forward some kind of, in most cases, an anonymous suggestion box or taking surveys, ways to enhance the operators and workers to come up with ideas, especially or suggestions or complaints, especially when they didn't want to be singled out as a person to bring those things up. So a lot of the metrics, whether short-term or long-term, were used through another Excel spreadsheet called the metrics spreadsheet. And you can see here why we felt it was important that not only that all of health and safety incidences are measured in lost time, but each plant should be able to speak of per month how many ergonomic incidences are, what percentage of total are they are present, and really to measure themselves to move forward. Some of the strengths that were communicated through this were that we found out that many plants weren't specifically tracking ergonomic related MSDs, so this definitely caused that to happen. Another thing that was required in one of the criteria was to communicate and post on their communication board a before and after PowerPoint slide. As you can see at the bottom there, that's an example. So this allowed impactful communication to the rest of the plant on what the ergonomics team was doing, and just getting better awareness of what ergonomics is and some of the things that you dealt with. Another good thing that happened through this was that quickly, since one document implementation before and after was required by each plant once per quarter, it started to build an abundant database, or we started to get abundant simple case studies submitted to us. So what we ended up developing in 2009, a couple years later, is a solutions database for Magna, which has just very simple descriptions of before and after. They could search by keyword, they could search by the group or the type of products they build, and really allowing the ergonomics team to get another resource to brainstorm or learn from each other. Some of the challenges for the metrics and communication were simply that the short-term metrics were somewhat redundant to some of the things that they're already measuring in category 2. So they were being accountable in 2 areas. So that was a challenge that they were not completed as often as we would like. And then definitely the targets, since we didn't require them to set a specific, so we didn't have a global target or a company-wide target, but more so we asked them to set a specific target. But this was difficult to maintain accountability, as some of the plants we felt set some arbitrary types of targets that didn't really work, that weren't really effective. So before I move on to results and statistics, I wanted to stop for some questions, and I think, Margot, in this case, because we've had some technical difficulties, and I do want to try to just answer a few questions, but definitely enough for the last two sections, because I do want to try to respect and try to keep this on time.
Sure. So we've got one, should be a quick one. Are office workstations considered in your ergonomics program?
That's a good question as well. Right now, the program that you see does not include office ergonomics. I mean, there's no question that every plant has a fair number of office workstations, and the corporate departments in the different group offices, we also have office ergonomics. Right now, some of them have incorporated it into their action plan. For the most part, we're looking for manufacturing risk analyses, as you can see in those tools, as well as action plans. However, we do have in our global website, assessment tools and review checklists for office ergonomics, and certain resources to help them to conduct those kind of assessments for those concerns. But I would say officially they're not enrolled into this program.
Thank you. In the ERA tool, how long afterwards did you do the follow-up?
The requirement for any of the tools was within 30 days after the implementation of the solution.
And did you have any tasks that did not easily fit in the ergonomic standardized tests use your analysis tools? I believe that probably means.
Sorry, repeat that question.
Sorry, Gary. Did you have any tasks that did not easily fit the ergonomic standardized tests used, which I believe are probably the tools, the NIOSH and Snook and so on?
Yeah, and you can see those tools. One thing we really wanted at our selection of tools, or any, because they don't have to use that toolbox necessarily. They really can use any tools that are sort of industry tools, or tools that have credibility in that sense. And one of the important things for it to be used in this program, or what we need for them to have, is a tool that actually separates into risk categories. Because our requirement for the action plan is risk reduction, the tool must delineate between high risk, moderate risk, low risk, those categories.
Thank you. It's a question on, I'd like to have more details about how people have been trained.
Sure. It's typically for ergonomics committee training, which is the core teams at each of the plants. It's typically 16 hours or 2 days. In that training, we mainly go over, obviously, ergonomic basics, learn about the injuries as well, but just as important is really workshops and learning the ergonomic analysis tools, and having them use them, taking real plant examples or videotapes, or going on the floor. It's sometimes harder to go on the plant floor, but getting videotapes of those jobs and going through those tools and using them.
And last question, could you give us some examples of the types of targets you are using?
The target one was a difficult one, and I think in our new criteria we kind of removed that one because they were being used very arbitrarily. We just felt that it was important for any metric, like anything, measuring something is important, but also having goals and targets is important as well. But we just didn't see them being set. So I think what we're moving towards, and this is not set in stone yet, is some kind of magnum target or based on performance. So it's going to be difficult, and that involves also safety as well. Obviously, safety incidences may be ergonomics, but perhaps the approach we may take, not sure, is outlining a more specific target throughout the company and seeing where you measure up against that, or at least compared to the rest of the people in your group or your product group.
Thanks, Gary. That's all the questions for that section. Okay,
so the results and statistics, I'm gonna just quickly talk about as I've been saying, metrics and communication is important, but it was also important for us as we developed this systematic program across the company, that we're also measuring some of the overall data to see if whether there's true impact or things that we need to work on. So first thing is we looked at just over the overall score, and here is a graph that shows you the overall DOT score, or the overall performance score for each plant across the last 5 years. So you can see in 2007, when we first started, it makes sense that it took some time for these plants to implement the program, and you know, a lot of plants here, in this case 70 or 80, were red, a full red in overall. But you can see over the 5 years that quickly started to reduce, and in fact this day we do still have a lot of red plants, but a lot of those red plants actually are new plants or new acquisitions by Magnum. And I think the good thing to also point out is that we have many plants that are now overall green, and we've come a long way since 2007, that the majority of our plants are now scoring that. And in fact, we went through some major changes for 2012, as I'll show you, but at the end of 2011, and looking at this graph, it did indicate to us that we did need to sort of raise the bar, and we simply did do that. And like any continuous improvement program, it's important to, in its right timing, to continue to ask more, or to push the plants more, and we've done that because of the high green scores that we now see. In relation to that, for sure, is ergonomic claim costs. And then again, I explained earlier why we chose the US plants, because of the specific and clear data that we can get. But it was important for us to see, well, now that we have these plants that are predominantly scoring a green, which means in our eyes that it's doing quite well, we wanted to see whether there was an impact on the percentage of claims, the number of claims in this case. Like, so this would be, of all of our total claims, health and safety, how many percent of them are related to ergonomics. So you can see definitely in the last 3 years that we slowly but surely have decreased down to only 45% of our claims. And you know, in the auto industries, we do typically see a higher amount, but more importantly, we see that continuous improvement in this area, where back in 2005-06, we were seeing close to 60 to 70% of our claim costs related to ergonomics, but now it's down to 45% roughly, and that's almost a 20% decrease. More importantly is, what kind of dollars does that lead to? And you can see that with the reduction of incidences in ergonomic claims and the reduction of percentage, it's also led to a significant reduction in the millions of dollars that our company is paying out just in our US plants. So you can see back in 05, 06, 07, we were paying upwards to over $12 million per year, and now the reduction, we're roughly paying around $5 to $6 million per year. So quite a significant drop. There are many factors that are leading to this, but the bottom line is that we are paying less, and there's a significant amount of savings that when your plant manager or the executive team is looking at these comp claims and costs in general, that they're seeing some good return and a positive reinforcement to why we need to continue to push this program and push ergonomics within our plants. We also recently won an innovation award from MIOSHA, so that's Michigan OSHA, and it was basically for innovation on something that reduced risk factors, and we had the director of MIOSHA come and present us that award. And the innovation was based on what you have seen today, which is the implementation of the metric criteria system. But like any system, a system is only a system if that's all it's doing. And so the MIOSHA delegates made sure to come to our plants to look at the solutions, the fixes that were put in place, interview the operators privately, talk to the Ergo team, talk to the management team to make sure that the system actually led to the right results, that they are reducing the risk to the operators on the plant floor. And that's also demonstrated through the injury statistics that they looked at. So the last section, or second last section, is really the continuous improvement in the future. I mentioned a number of challenges that we learned over the last 5 years, and we really drawed upon the feedback from a lot of the plant committees, a lot of the coordinators, the engineering managers, the management teams, to really get an idea so we know what needs to help, what changes we need to make to help the plants improve further moving down. So there are many changes, small and large, that we've implemented, but I wanted to just outline quickly the 3 key changes for 2012. Number one, we felt that a definite need, we needed to increase the weighting of implementation and risk reduction category 3. We need to see a little bit better, even though we were happy with the Excel spreadsheet to track our ergo analysis tools, we want to see more integration. People want to see more integration of those inputs and archive integrated into our overall program. And thirdly, which is tied to the first two, is really a streamlining of the number of criteria and documentation files. You can see from first part that there are many documents that have to be submitted and a lot of criteria. So we had to streamline that a bit and make it more efficient process. So first one is increasing the weighting of category 3. We put more weighting on this category more than all the other ones. We felt that part of that in 3.3 was that we kind of went away from the 90-day completion period, and basically what now the requirement is for 3.3 is that we want to see 5 risk reduction solutions per quarter at a minimum, and that would be how you would gain credit for this particular criterion. And we bumped up the weight so much that even specifically for this criterion alone, 3.3, that if they were not closing at least 5 items per quarter, that they would not be able to get an overall green in their overall score. We also provided functionality that, since we are a small team that has many plants, we felt the better way to understand the solutions was that every solution had to have an after photo attached. And because we were raising the bar on this particular section, we also felt that building an online ergonomics action plan module or an action plan module was very important. So you can see here, instead of those disorganized spreadsheets that we were seeing, we've now moved on to an action management system that's online that can look at the different action items open. It tells you the scores, the tools used and the scores, the progress, who they're assigned to, and the due dates. Number 2 major change, even though we felt that the spreadsheet or ERM spreadsheet was successful, we did feel that we need to get away from all the some of the problems with Excel and the fact that it couldn't talk to the rest of the systems in our development in the ergonomics program. So we're in stage of developing this year what we call a magnet database for all the ergonomic analysis tool inputs. So a lot of those things I showed you in the risk management spreadsheet with the individual postures or the individual points of these tools, we're going to try to move that into a online system. And so this online system, this is in a prototype stage. As you can see, you have all the information that's important to know about the job, but more importantly, below that you can see for each job what actions are open, and this has already been built. I showed you the action plan module. This has already been built, so that will be built in, but this is the one we're working on, which is the ergonomic activity. So by date you can see which type of analysis was done, sort of the overall score, but if I clicked onto that ERA link, it would then bring me into the individual body part scores or the individual boxes that were even checked for that. So we're hoping to bring that all together into one system. So that really helps accomplish the 3rd major change, which was streamline and reduce documentation. And our goal as as our system begins to grow, some of the basic principles that we're trying to live by is that we want all ergonomics data to have a single point of entry. We want all ergonomics data to be saved and archived in an effective format. We want all elements integrated within one system, that they're talking to each other simultaneously. And lastly, the result of all that, hopefully, is a fluid flow of risk data, scores, action, and reporting up to senior management. So as you can see here, we are trying to bring this all together. In 2007 is what that system of scoring and the criteria which I showed you, we launched that already. As I mentioned to you, in 2009, because of those case studies, we were able to build a solution database. Just starting this year, basically, now they have an online action plan module. And lastly, what we're in development and hope to be launching next year is that Magna database that allows them to now enter the assessment tool specifics that ties it into the rest of the program. I want to try to just finish up. I know there might be some questions, but I want to just finish off my webinar presentation as and then open it up to the lines, and people can stay on or choose to log off. But I wanted to end with just some comments about the global rollout strategy and just a summary to what I've talked about today. As I showed you from the beginning, we are a global company, and in some ways, doing North America first, approximately 120 plants, was sort of a good preparation for what's to come. In the we've learned a lot in these 5 years that we have applied to now in Asia. So we've just launched this similar program into Asia this past January. We've also started and launched it in Western and Eastern Europe starting 2012. And the goal is to, by 2013, also have this up and running in South America. I wanted to just discuss some of the challenges. We're also, as I'm going through that right now and learning a lot actually with the different challenges of a global rollout, and anybody who has somewhat of responsibility over different countries, feel free to contact me, and we can share sort of ideas and some of the challenges, because there are many. For example, languages. We already currently have the whole system, the online database, the criteria, the tools and templates. Everything is in English, Spanish, German, and Chinese. But you can imagine there are many more languages, especially in Europe. But we feel it's important that ergonomic teams are operating in their first language. There are many legislation differences between continents and between countries. We have to try to now maintain a more consistent auditing or review process, that a plant that scores yellow in Mexico is the same as a yellow scoring plant in Austria. So we want to make sure that those scores are apples to apples. Training, right now, in somewhat, our corporate team is doing some of that training, but you can imagine that we're in need of hiring contract interpreters, and that significantly increases the cost for the simultaneous translation. And so even though we're doing that to start, we're looking also for qualified consulting or qualified ergonomists in specific countries for them to deliver the training of our material, or similar, that to teach them the tools and the system. And lastly, no matter, North America has different tools that are used in the UK and in Europe and even in Asia. There are different tools that are specific to their government associations or legislation that we're learning about and that need to be incorporated into their programs, and there's a lot of challenges to that as well. So that's just an overview of how we're moving forward with the global rollout and some of the challenges we're facing. I do want to leave this webinar with some overall lessons learned, because there's some major things that we've learned, and I wanted to make sure to communicate that at the end here. Is that the first one is persevere through initial resistance. When we dropped this program and this requirement to all the plants in North America, you can imagine there was quite a bit of resistance, you know, right down for the safety coordinator, the HR team, the engineering manager, the management team. And my advice and what we found was that we had to really fight and persevere through this initial resistance. And really, just like in the case where I talked about the engineering manager, this was the case for plant management and all the different people that resisted at the beginning. After they saw the program in place for some time, it started to pick up in value, and they understood that it was very systematic, and it actually helped many of the people's jobs were at the plant. So that's my first lesson learned. Part of that, as I said, that persevering through that resistance was the management and engineering support. And I would have to say that getting the management engineering support was a key factor, and that whether you're looking at a corporate level or at a plant level, it really hinges on that you have that support. And it doesn't mean that they're doing the day-to-day items of an ergonomics committee, but more so that they are supporting and you know, providing, as we said, resources or the personnel to get the job done. One overall lesson that we found too is that quantification of the system, the criteria, the metrics, and the risk scores from the tools was very important. You can imagine, to get the support from management engineering, they like to see numbers. They like to look at things quantitatively. And we know that in some cases ergonomics may not be necessarily fully quantitative, but I think the tools that you use to present your case and to systematically run your program do need to be quantified in order to see how improvement is made, why risk reduction is seen, cost savings, and also performance, as I showed you in different dot colors throughout the plant. So quantification is very important. That is what we have found. And lastly is the ergonomics overall score, which basically hinges on what the plants were being looked at from the group presidents and ultimately from the executive team. This was important that even though the plant manager is the top person in each of the plant, it was important that this dot or this ergonomic score was seen above the plant manager. So whether that is the group presidents or higher, that keeps all the plants and the plant managers accountable. And so that was a very important aspect as well, to keep this program continually improving. So I would say an overall summary that over the last 5 years we were able to develop an effective ergonomics program and metric system by establishing a robust system based on a standard set of criteria, that we needed to create a central database, maybe because of the number of plants that we're dealing with. We needed to give the plants a tool that they could manage and use to handle their assessments, to handle their actions, that we could look at, their managers can look at, and they themselves can use on a day-to-day basis. And lastly, as one of the things I said at the beginning, is that we wanted to increase the frequency of reporting and therefore increase the accountability. That quarterly has been a tremendous asset, that each quarter each plant has the opportunity to improve their quarterly score, but it also keeps at the forefront of the managers, but also the ergonomics teams that they're being evaluated. So I just want to conclude with that, and want to now just open it up to any questions. Sort of sped through the last part there, but I hope at the end of the day these overall lessons learned summary can be something that can provide some help, you know, to things that possibly maybe your company or your profession can try and learn from. But I'm definitely going to leave my contact information because I know there might be some more detailed questions, and I'm happy to take these questions on a side on a different day even. And also, I think Margot mentioned that if you wanted a copy of the slides of this presentation, just send me an email and I'll be happy to send you a copy of it. So at this point, I thank you for your time for this ACE webinar, and I want to just for the people to hang on and see if there's any questions.
Okay, so I'm not showing any questions right now in the question box, but we'll maybe just take a minute, and if people do have questions. I know that we're over time here. I'm sorry about that. All of us got kicked out there at that one point. I think what happened is our Momentum conferencing person that was helping us with some technical issues we had earlier, because he was in as a host when he left, he turned it off and we all got kicked out. So we will learn this. This is our first webinar. Hopefully
it's quite ironic.
Exactly. I know. I thought it was kind of funny. But anyways, hopefully this recording has turned out okay, and we'll be able to put that up for people to access as desired at a later time. We also have upcoming webinars. One coming up, we're trying to arrange on whole body vibration with the same panel that did the session at the London conference. I've talked to Jim Potvin about doing one on his new work on duty cycle. I've talked to some people at the International Ergonomics Association about doing one on just on the association and how to get involved. And a couple of my contacts there with some international people. So we've got lots of leeway with webinars now using this voice over internet protocol. I know there can be some issues with the speakers, but it certainly allows us to bring in people internationally as well. So if you have ideas, things you want to present, or people you want to hear from, please let us know, and we'll try and make that happen. So if you need to leave, we understand that. We'll keep recording and answering the questions here so that you can go back and look at it. And thanks very much for everyone for attending. So I do have a couple questions here, Gary, for you.
Great.
Okay, so I've got one. What changes did you make in order to overcome the cut and paste problem with the policy templates?
What we did was we had a very specific policy and procedure almost spelled out. You know, we wanted to add the detail as an example of what you could do, but as I said, one of the challenges was we found a lot of plants were maybe just changing the name of the plant or the document, or very minor changes. So what we did in this revision for 2012, we made it much shorter, but we almost listed off more subheadings or categories. For example, we would say, you know, committee members, ergonomics committee members, and have a blank box for them to fill out who they were, what department, and you know, so that's an example of providing more headings that make sure that they have important elements of a good procedure. I mean, of course, they can still change things, but then they would definitely have to fill these things out in order to, they would actually take time to think about the process and procedures in order to get this complete. So we think that's going to definitely improve the quality of the policies and procedures. But as I said, this is a change we just recently made, and we'll be able to take a look at that in the upcoming months and years.
Okay, and I've got one that's, I'm not as familiar with the ERA tool as some of the others. Could you talk more about that?
Sure. This is a Magna sort of tool that we use and developed internally. It breaks it down into all the different body parts: back, neck, left shoulder, right shoulder, left, right elbow, left, right wrists, and you know, some secondary factors as well as enhancers. And really, what we did here was we took it was an internally developed tool that we drawed upon all our threshold points for force, posture, and repetition. We looked at research and that showed those threshold points. So all of the points that for the postures, the force, the repetition would be from an ANSI standard, a prominent paper in industry and ergonomics, and we felt that that was the best way that we could not come up with our own sort of you know, force and posture values, but more so drawing upon the literature in order to come up with something that was hopefully simple, but captured all the different body part risk scores, as we felt that, you know, the NIOSH and the SNOOK in the strain index. They're somewhat task specific, and they are analyzing. And we really needed a tool that looked at the job as an entirety, and so we felt that was the best way to do it at that time.
Okay, and what was the total or estimated cost of implementing your program, or have you even looked at that, I guess?
It's a good question, and I think it's hard to necessarily, if you talk about man hours, definitely hard to put a value to that. But, you know, if I had to estimate, I mean, it's grown a lot. You can see a lot of the new systems and modules that we're building now. But the original 2007 module, which just really has the criteria listed in a place that has a place to store documents and a way that people can access. I mean, we're probably talking about in the 10,000s, so not maybe as much as some people think, but still a lot of money. It's hard for me to give an exact number at this point because we did a lot of building upon the initial, but you know, roughly 25,000. But you know, we're talking about a much different scope. I mean, a lot of things had to be in place to be put in to be reachable to 120 plants, and so depending on the size of your plant and depending on the nature of the Extendio program, it might be quite different.
Thanks. How you were talking about overcoming resistance for those engineering managers who had to lead the ergonomics committee. So when you got that resistance from them, were they then mandated? Like, how did you bridge that gap even to get them looking at the tools that you had developed? Did management come in and say, you will do this, you may be resistant, or you know, how was that gap bridged?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it is an important bridge, I think, for many ergonomists, especially in the manufacturing sector. That I'd say there's a combination of different ways that was done, and for the more resistant type of engineering managers, because it is spelled out, and it was a little bit of apprehension when we first put that in. We were like, we're going to get some pretty big pushback if we put this in as one of the criteria elements. Basically, it says engineering manager leads and directs the committee. But we felt it was important, and we felt that we had to stand by that. And so in a lot of cases, they were sort of voluntold to do it and begrudgingly did do it. And as I said, over time, they started to see the value, and it became something they accepted. But there are some of them that were already doing some ergonomics, and some engineering manager who sort of bought in ergonomics. Those ones adapted quite easily. They liked the fact that there was a system and a way that they could manage it. So it really was different on different avenues. But you know, at the end of the day, it is one criteria item. So if they didn't have that engineering manager lead their committee, they wouldn't get a red automatically on their overall score. But we made sure to make that criteria element high because we do really feel it's very important. So they would be losing significant points without having that designation.
Thank you. That's all the questions that we have in the system. I have many appreciations of thanks in the chat area for your presentation, Gary. So thank you very much for that. If there's other questions for the people left on here that come on, as Gary mentioned, he's more than happy if you email him to answer those, and let him know if you want a copy of the presentation as well. And hopefully this is recorded all fine and it will work out, and we'll be that up for you as well. So any closing comments, Gary?
No, I just want to thank and appreciate your time, Margot and Ace, to set this up. And as you said, that moving forward, I think webinars are, you know, in a certain medium, media, it does reach certain people. So I hope that you know, people who are, you know, watching it recorded can also participate at a later date, and feel free to email me with any questions. And I thank everyone for taking the time to participate in today's webinar.
All right, thanks everyone. We'll leave the webinar now. Gary, I'll let you come out of your screen share so you can take a look at the chat if you like, and questions that you've answered. I'll give you some time. I won't close everything down until then. Christiane, make sure that you don't close this out, because apparently that will close the whole thing. And everyone else, thank you very much, and have a great afternoon or evening, depending on where you are.
Thanks, everyone.